Hello everyone, my name is Akal and I am a sexual energy coach as well as a tantra teacher. I teach Kundalini yoga, several other things. I also design programs which help individuals sort of push the reset button on their sexual energy because of what I consider one of the most important topics, but also one of the largest challenges which affects our overall life force energy. But it's one of the things that there's been a big tug of war around sexual energy that's happened for a very long time, which I'm going to go to in this video. So this video is very much about the distortions around sexual energy. Now, if you're interested in any sort of coaching, whether it's in-person coaching, over Zoom, or if you want to purchase one of my coaching programs, which I have available in video format, you can check out the links down below this video. So the distortion around sexual energy. Okay, so this is an interesting topic. Due to the work I do, I'm very connected to, I would consider, the left side of this progression. Now, I'm going to go into explaining this in a moment. So the one thing I want to emphasize here is whether, and I'm using right or left as these are not political or even religious designations. I mean, I know like in Tantra, you have a left-hand path and a right-hand path. And also politically speaking, there's a right and a left. And I know these things, they do exist. But really what these things are reflecting is a polarity, okay? So now this is going to get a little conspiratorial, this video, because it is conspiratorial. Conspiracy is a real thing. Conspiracy theories are generally, often proven correct. So when we're looking at this particular topic, what we're looking at is a basic understanding of a pyramid structure. So what is a pyramid structure? And I'm going to go ahead and relay a really quick story to you before I get into this. So it was the beginning of the pandemic, July 2020, so relatively at the beginning. I asked the universe, what's happening? What's going on here? What are we experiencing? And it seems like some of these issues around the pandemic are starting to rear their head once again here as I speak in August of 2023. So it's really important to keep in mind these things. And what the universe told me, and this was instantaneous, again, I was asking the universe at that point because I was coming from a place of fear and confusion, and I needed a little bit of clarity. But I was at that point, I was very tapped into sort of the collective issue of fear and confusion. So I asked the universe what's happening, and the universe simply said, web, not pyramid. You can derive whatever interpretation you want of that, but this is what popped in my head. It was immediate. There was no thought connected to it, and I was like, oh, that's what's happening. And I did about an hour Kundalini yoga prior to asking this question. So I was in a very focused, centered, meditative place, which is why I believe it was indeed a sort of divine download. Web, not pyramid. So what is a pyramid? Pyramid is a structure of top-down authoritarian control. This can be in the form of a religion or a corporation or any sort of structure coming from top down. And this structure applies to everything that we perceive, at least in sort of common, the everyday sort of material plane existence, right? Is that religion, like I said, businesses, religious institutions, everything kind of trickles down from a pyramid structure, right? So the base of the pyramid is where all the energy is, but it's all being funneled upward. You could say the energy is represented in these structures by, let's say, money, right? So money is not energy, by the way. Money is a middleman between your energy, your time, your efforts, and and essentially, getting some sort of exchange for those things. So money represents a middleman. The problem is money is not money. Money is not energy because money can be manipulated. It can be manipulated through printing more money, inflation, etc. Again, the Federal Reserve System in the U.S. tends to control and manipulate money a great deal. Prints more of it, prints less of it, etc. So hence it is not your energy. However, again, it is a representation in some way. So We've existed collectively as humanity under pyramid structures for a very long time. And so the current stage that we are in is also, once again, a pyramid structure. It's not religion. So when we're talking about the distortion of sexual energy, what we're actually looking at here is who's at the top of the pyramid. And I would argue that it's always been the same people at the top of the pyramid, and they really don't care. They don't care about conservatism versus liberalism. They don't care about religion or any of these things. What they care about is control and power. So whether they're using their mode of control and power through religion on the right, or if they're using it through the left, and well, I'm going to generally call that liberalism, all right? I don't mean that in the sense of, again, not politically. I'm simply mean liberal, meaning permissive, okay? So these are our polarities. In the oscillation between these polarities, those who are at the top of the pyramid know this quite well, that there's an oscillation that happens naturally within each of us between these polarities. Meaning, we'll say the right-hand path generically is the movement towards purity, right? So we could say purity or orthodoxy. And the left-hand path is towards anything goes, permissive, right? So both of them, on their extremes, are toxic. Toxic. And I mean that in the deepest sense of the word. These are nasty, nasty energies on either side on the extreme, and here's why. Because they're both moralistic. I use the word moralistic. We tend to associate moralistic with the right or the religious path, but the reality is it has to do with a judgment of good or bad. So those who are moralistic on the sort of left hand or the permissive or the anything goes path, those people think that the religious folks are all evil. So hence it is a moralistic judgment. So that's what I mean by moralistic. It is a judgment of good or bad. All right, so, and I don't have to go into the religious side of things. We all know that moralism tends to get associated with the right. So now going back to what is the distortion? So historically speaking, many of you know this, sexual energy has been distorted for a very long time through religion. That is currently not the issue, right? I'm speaking from an American perspective or a Western perspective, okay? So I understand perhaps if I lived in a different country that, you know, the religion still might very much be the dominant factor. But in the US, in Canada, Australia, Western Europe, etc., religion's not the controlling factor. Okay, so here's what happened historically. So religion in the past says sex is bad, right? Or sex is simply for reproductive purposes. And they may not have said that very specifically, but that was the general message. It was a lot of what? Guilt and shame built up around sexual energy. What happens when you attach, and again, it's the guilt and shame we hold within. Okay, we take on the message, so you can let it in or not. That's really important to keep in mind here. If you're walking around, you have moralistic judgments about other sexual expression or your own sexual expression, you need to look at it. Okay, you need to look at that. You're only responsible. You can't control other people, right? So you're only responsible for your own actions. So if you have a judgment about someone else, I guarantee it's impacting your own energy. So be greedy about your own energy, all right? There is something called divine selfishness. You continue to work on yourself so that you can shine from the inside out. So the idea here is that to release any moral judgments you have about others, right? And simply to be responsible for your own behaviors and your own, how you're shining out into the world. If you have shame or guilt built up around your sexual expression due to, let's say, religious influence, essentially what guilt and shame does, there's a book, many of you who are watching this video, if you've been on a spiritual path for a while, you may know this book. It's called Power versus Force. I don't remember the author offhand, but in Power versus Force, it talks about guilt and shame basically being the lowest vibrational state just above death, okay? So in this book, it talks about a scale from 0 to 1,000. 0 is you're dead. There's no energy for life. 1,000 is you've achieved the Tibetan rainbow body and you've dissolved into ash, essentially. And I believe neutral was like 200 or 180 or 200 or something like that. And also, just so you understand a little bit, anger, I believe, was right around 160. So actually, there was a lot of energy if you're angry, right? So that's why so many things get done in the world when someone's angry. However, if you're functioning from guilt and shame, that is a deep repressive force that is essentially killing you, okay? So in order to, one needs to liberate themselves from this pattern, but you have to recognize the pattern in the first place. Now I'm going to get into solutions soon towards the end of this video. First off, I want to kind of lay the foundation. So I call the right hand extreme here, so the oscillation or the pendulum swing to the right, which we've already historically kind of been through, I call that the black hole of tension and restriction. So that's the black hole of tension and restriction. Again, these are the moralistic religious forces that say sex bad or it's only for reproduction, okay? It overlooks a real basic principle, which is that sex can not only be used for reproduction, of course, it can be used for pleasure. And that's what I'm going to get to in a moment on the left side of things. But sex can also, and this is where the merger point happens between the right and the left-hand path of extremes, which has to do with the recognition that sexual energy can be used for transformational purposes and to connect one to source. And when I say source, I mean God. I mean generate, organize, destroy. That's my definition of God. You can have your own definition of God. What I'm talking about is the universe, the infinity, the big picture, the void, or the totality. It is the all, right? Okay, so the orgasm will link us to that. Breath work will link us to that. Meditation will link us to that. So a real basic way, if I'm a controller at the top of a pyramid, it doesn't matter if the pyramid's on the left or the right. If I'm wanting top-down control, I'm going to distort something so basic. Sexual energy sits towards our root. It is a foundational piece. If we're talking about the pyramid, which exists as a human structure, we're talking about the energy, all the energies down here at the bottom being shunted upward towards the top, right? The crown. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot about the sort of human energy body and the presence of pyramids within the human energy body, but I will say that foundationally speaking, sexual energy is a foundational energy, and it is the energy that controls your digestion. It is the energy that controls your cognition. It is the energy that controls your immunity, your healing. Other words, it's general life force energy. So if you want to mess with some people on a large level, you shame them or give them guilt about their sexual expression. They've did this to gay folks. They've done this to people in general. So now we're at a really interesting phase because what was in I'm going to use some general terms. It was in the late 1960s or so, probably early 1960s. It doesn't really matter. At least here in the U.S., there was a bit of a sexual revolution happening. And during that sexual revolution, they were starting to move away from the sort of guilt, the repression, or what I can call, the black hole of tension and restriction. The tension and restriction, it limits the flow of energy. It limits the flow of energy. It keeps it all the way repressed down towards our root. And we're functioning from our root, we're functioning from a place of scarcity, trauma, fear, and the inability to connect to the higher centers. And if we don't have the ability to connect to the higher centers, we don't have the ability to connect to one another universally. We don't have, and most of all, we don't have the ability to connect to source. So hence, if I'm a religious authority, I'm going to say, oh yeah, you can only connect to God through the priest or whatever the religious figure is. And again, that's a tremendous distortion. But if people's energy is all messed up and repressed, if they're worried about survival and basic things like sexual reproduction, then it's very easy to control these people. Now, in the current situation, like I said, in the 1960s, with this like revolution of sexual energy, it started happening around one sexual expression, this started to loosen and break apart. So we started to shift from right to left. Sounds good, right? And it was good. You know, it was a good thing to happen. We have to go through evolutions. I believe it was Ken Wilber. Some of you, anyway, you can look him up. He's kind of a Buddhist philosopher type, wrote lots of interesting books. Well, one of the things I got from one of his books was talking about how an ideology transforms over time. In that when an ideology first comes to the surface, its intentions are very good and they rise to the surface and become popular because that's needed at that point in time. And so sexual liberation probably goes back to the late 1800s, you could say, or even earlier, but it really started to take hold in the 60s, we'll say. So as people started to liberate themselves sexually, we started to loosen our grip on the sexual energy. Energies started to flow again, which is really great. However, that leads us to what also Calvin Rober said, which is an ideology comes to the surface initially because it's a very good thing and it's needed, but eventually, the telephone game happens, right? We all know the telephone game. You say something to the one person's ear, and then they say to another person. By the time it gets around to the 20th person or so, the original content is a little bit distorted. And so this is what's happening. We are at the point of what I consider extreme distortion on the left side of things. So as bad as the repressive aspect was on the right, it's equally as horrible on the left. And I mean that, horrible. It's the black hole of discharge and delusion. Okay, so discharge and delusion. So what's the new religion running on the left here? I would call it sex positivity. It's this idea that porn is somehow an okay thing. I would say, hey, I'll give you a quick example. I had a client who went to his therapist. His therapist said, and unfortunately, a lot of therapists, I'm sorry if you're a psychotherapist or a social worker and you're watching this, I don't mean to step on you. I know you're well-intentioned and you don't want your clients to feel guilt and shame. So you tell them things like masturbation and ejaculation are okay. But be honest with yourself. Do you understand sexual energy? Do you understand the flow of energy in general? If you can start to understand that in general, which perhaps is maybe why you're watching this video, then you're going to learn to give different kind of advice. Because what this gentleman came to me, he was masturbating daily, up to 2 to 3 times a day, ejaculating constantly, and he was 28 and could not get an erection anymore. If you're 28 and you can't get an erection anymore, there's something wrong. That is not, I'm not even going to use the term normal, right? Anyway, let me leave it. I'll leave it at that. Just ponder that for a moment. So my advice to him was, stop doing it for a week. Other words, you need to move to the right a little bit and exercise a little grip, a little discipline, right? So you could say generically, like the left-hand side of things over here is no discipline, where the right side is too much. And I've gone through both of these. I've gone through both of them, and I've seen the issues around both of them. So the black hole of discharge and delusion, and this idea that any sexual expression is fantastic. It's wonderful. You've got therapists and social workers who are all supporting this and say, yay, you're expressing yourself. And it is so insidious because people are getting applauses for wasting their energy. And that's the issue with the sort of I'm going to say liberal, but I don't mean that politically. The being too liberal with one's sexual energy is it's too permissive and you're discharging it all the time, particularly if you're a dude. And I'm not going to get into how women respond to this because this is, anyway, I'm not a woman, so I'm not going to speak on those subjects. But the sexual energy piece is really important for women as well. And women bear tremendous responsibility when they behave sexually because they have to potentially bring a life into the world as a child. So a lot of consideration has to go into whether or not to have sex for a woman as well and who they're having sex with, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all huge considerations. So this idea that on the left-hand side of things that people are supposed to be releasing their energy all the time and everyone's supposed to be having sex with everyone and it's on and on and on and on. Read Brave New World if you want to have a good approximation of where this goes to in terms of sexual expression in the future. You'll see some real disturbing things in that particular book. Again, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. Highly recommended you read it if you want to understand what happens with permissive, extreme left sexual energy distortion, okay? So the distortion on the left leads to there's nothing sacred around one's sexual energy. Just experience it as pleasure. All the time, pleasure. Being pleasure positive and sex positive and all this is wonderful, right? If you're coming from a place of repression, guilt, and shame, yes, recognizing there's pleasure there is really helpful. But again, this is the individual that has to oscillate between these extremes. The messaging or the narratives that we're currently getting in the West around sexual expression, around gender expression, around all these things is very confusing and very distorting for a lot of people. The idea that everyone should be having sex with everyone, and and again, it's like there's hookup apps, and again, there's narratives. All these narratives are basically supporting pornography, supporting these sorts of things. And so, again, if I'm the top-down authority structure, the pyramid, right? So if I'm from the pyramid on top, I'm going to be like, yeah, let's push these messages around like, yes, you should be like totally comfortable with your sexual expression and you should be doing it constantly. In fact, it should be a huge part of who you are, your lifestyle, right? So that's another thing. What I consider the most insidious aspect of the left is when sexual expression is your life and who you are. So we begin to identify with our sexual expression as who we are as a human being. What does that do? That separates you. That separates you from the people who don't share that lifestyle. It also, what it does is that it hooks the ego into a particular way of expressing sexual energy. Kink, fantasy, lifestyle expression, all this is very supported by the sex positive community. And again, if you're a sex positive community, I apologize. I don't mean to, insult you or any way, but the reality is that it's about finding balance for individuals. Okay, so and generally speaking, cultures and society aren't the best guides. So that being said, it comes up to the individual here, right? So the individual has to choose whether he wants to find his place in the middle, because both of these things have something very positive to offer, right? The right offers discipline and a sort of restraint, which is needed. In astrology, you could say that's Saturn, right? So on the left, it's the express, don't feel shame. Again, very useful messaging, but the individual has to find the balance point. And how do we find the balance point? We have to find it within. We have to, one, recognize I feel drained, or two, recognize I'm having difficulty with orgasm, or I'm having difficulty with all my internal judgments around my own sexual expression, right? We can recognize these patterns within. And it's through the recognition of the patterns within that we find the solution, which is cultivating awareness. As we cultivate awareness and cultivate choice, then we can kind of dominate these two pyramid structures, which I guarantee are top-down authoritarian control. And so when we start to understand how this is all working, we, the individual, can understand what the universe told me at the beginning of the pandemic, which was web, not pyramid. Web is the implication that we're all connected, right? So in order for us to all be connected, we have to recognize that there is no separation between you and me, right? We all identify with our gender, or our sexual expression, or our race, or whatever. Those are all part of the illusion. Not to say unimportant. It's important for the ego, spiritually speaking, unimportant. So what I'm going to get into now is, I guess, what are the solutions for the distortion? And again, I want to say is that the distortion is both individual and collective. But again, this is from my perception. My perception is that how we change the collective distortion is each individual needs to transform, and meaning we need to recognize through some organic outgrowth, some natural outgrowth, how the sexual energy is distorted. So we need to recognize that, and secondarily, then we need to take the necessary measures in order to sort of realign to what is authentic. So because there's no way to legislate this. There's no way to pass laws and things of that nature. Because what you end up getting is you end up getting a top-down authoritarian structure who's attempting to control sexual energy once again. So don't count on government or religious some sort of religious entity or anything like that to create the guidelines which we're going to need to get out of this. So the solution, well, there's probably a lot of different solutions, but this is the one I'm going to propose to you, which is to purify. It's to purify or to distill the sexual energy. Now, how is this done? Awareness, right? And it's this horribly basic explanation of how to do things, but it's the reality, right? Like, awareness is the only way to do things in terms of to transform this energy, because the energy is innate and within. And so, essentially, from point A to point B, our life path is very much about cultivating awareness. So when we cultivate awareness, essentially we shine light on something. And the process of shining light on something makes it objective. We can then see it and perceive it. Once we can see it and perceive it, then eventually from objectivity we move into a sort of a transformational process. And this transformational process changes how the energy flows. How it flows is augmented once again through the awareness. The individual recognizes the patterns that are connected in this particular case to the sexual energy. So that traumas, desires, things of that nature. And again, when I say these things, I don't mean them to be negative, but simply these are aspects of our individual growth. We need to recognize these things and not pass a judgment on them, and instead simply allow these things to manifest at the surface. Be present with it, be neutral with it, be objective with it, witness it. I'm going to use all these terms because hopefully it clarifies something. And then, like I said, over time, they simply transform on their own terms. However, that is the assumption that we're not continuing to feed energy back into the cycle. So, and what I mean by that is if you attempt to negate something, you send energy to it. You say that's bad, you actually send energy to something. Now, if you say that's great, that's wonderful, you also send energy to it. So neutrality is pretty much the preferred way of creating this purity or to purifying some charge. And like I said, in this case, sexual energy. So now the second way, the second understanding we need to have about this whole process of purifying sexual energy goes into the feeling and sensing process. Sexual energy, I can talk about in all these sort of esoteric kind of ways, but what it is, it's our overall life force, right? So it is connected to our overall life force. Sexual energy is only life force as it's concentrated around the genitalia. So other words, we have to go into the experiencing phase. The experiencing phase is feeling and sensing, right? So feeling and sensing. And so let me clarify really quick. Energy as it's experienced, how it manifests. Energy is an incredibly vague word. So you can experience energy as heat, as tingling sensations, as sound, movement within. Let's see what else. Again, just the whole sensory realm of things. Experience it as light, a pulsation inside the body. You're getting the point here. It's layers upon layers upon layers of feeling and sensing potential here. So what I suggest everyone do if you want to purify your sexual energy is you need to connect to it. You need to connect to it in a sort of a subtle way. Now, how I would propose you do this would be to take a deep breath in and contract and relax the genitals. Contract and relax the genitals until you feel a pulse. Go ahead and exhale. Again, contracting and relaxing the genitals. You want to start to deepen that breath. Slow your respiration rate. Inhaling, retaining briefly. Exhaling, retaining out briefly. Contracting, relaxing the genitals until you feel the horny sensation rise. If you want to create a stronger stimulus, that's perfectly fine. But the problem is we sometimes get hooked into the stronger stimulus. So having a subtle stimulus is something we can kind of be more present with, and we don't feel like we necessarily need to engage it. So the next step, once you feel something, is to dive deep into it. It's to go into the various layers. And so you're connecting to that sexual energy. You're not running from it, and you're not trying to do anything with it. In other words, you're not expressing it nor repressing it. As I talked about earlier, those are the sources of the distortion, is the overexpression and the over-repression of sexual energy is the distortion. So in this particular case, we're simply connecting to the charge. We're feeling and sensing, we're going into it, we're embodying it. And not only that, but from the genitalia, how does this energy, where else do you feel it in your body, right? It may have a number of manifestations anywhere within the body, and it may not feel sexy when it's up between your shoulder blades, but you may notice your shoulder blades. And again, it's all connected. It's all connected. There is nothing separate within you. Everything is intertwined. So as long as you keep that in mind, is that you may feel it in your shoulder, you may feel it in your lower back, you may feel it in your belly, you may feel it inside your head. It can manifest in a number of different ways. Again, this is simply energy. Sexual energy is only the energy as it's concentrated around the genitals. I repeat that 1,000 times because it's incredibly important to understand. So once you've kind of connected to the energy, the overall energy, then what you need, what I would like you to do, I'll say you need to, but what I would like you to do then is to understand how important it is. This is not only the energy, again, your overall life force energy. So again, this is the energy which vitalizes your entire existence, but this is also the energy that animates everything, right? So it's not, when I say that, it's not sexual energy that is animating the life of a flower or a plant. But again, the life force which is within you is also the life force which is literally, like I said, it manifests in all creation. So understand it as significant. So you're allowing expansion to occur in this process. So we're giving many, many layers of importance here. Why is that? If we understand something as sacred, and if we have gratitude, right? So sacred and gratitude, these two words do what? It pulls you into your heart space. When you connect to the heart space, you're connecting into, you're weaving the mind into the heart in a lot of ways, but you're also going into presence. When you're in your heart, you're in presence. And when you're in presence, you can then see the commonality, the connection, that which is universal between every single human being, right? So what we're shedding here is our likes, our dislikes, our desires, what we're attracted to, what we're not attracted to. All these things are part of this purification process. And I know it's a little bit esoteric, I understand that. And so some of these realizations may come to you rather naturally as a download, and some of these things may remain as part of your intellect for quite some time, and then all of a sudden you may have a couple experiences in life, you'll be like, oh, that's what he's talking about. So, and then the final step that I would say is pretty necessary here. Like I said before, I use this word allow, right? So allowing doesn't pass a judgment on something. It doesn't say this is good or bad, like I mentioned before. What allowing does is it brings something to the surface and you can simply be present with it. Because we want to understand the nature of the things that we desire to do sexually. That's incredibly important. And again, do we have to understand specifically that this desire is related to that trauma? No, we don't need to go into the specifics necessarily, although you may have very specific connections here. But what we're doing here is by bringing awareness to something, we're slowly disconnecting it. We're sort of, in a way, we're unplugging the energy from that pattern, right? So let's in this particular case, I put down here at the bottom, know your tools. All right, so kinks, fantasies, pornography, visual aids, becoming real hyper focused on your partner's sexy bits, things of that nature. These are all sort of ways in which we can amplify sexual energy. Other words, it's the tool, right? And this is an analogy many of you have probably heard at some point, which is you use a hammer, you are not the hammer, right? So what do I mean by these kinks and fantasies and things that are like that are a tool? Well, we can access these things in order to raise the heat. Tantrically speaking, this can be practical, right? But this is not the space from which you want to have orgasm, right? You don't want to have an orgasm in fantasy, in kink, because what it does is it sends energy back into the pattern. So to engage something and then to disengage something. So in other words, allow the kink to rise. This is the scenario, you're with a partner. Okay, so you're with a partner, you allow the kink to rise, you go into some dirty talk, whatever it is in order to amplify the heat. then you got to come back to presence, right? So you bring it back to presence. So, other words, like I said, there's this difference between cool arousal and hot arousal, and sometimes hot arousal is useful. That's all I'm saying with this. Cool arousal is the preferred way, because in cool arousal, you're deeper into sensations. You know, the expression less is more is very true in a tantric context. We're learning to become very, very sensitive. However, not all of us are there yet. If you have strong fantasies and kinks in your life, or you identify with a lifestyle, to me that's the most insidious one, is when you identify with a lifestyle. Because, again, how you express yourself sexually is not who you are. It's incredibly meaning your true nature, which is presence itself, right? So we're learning to recognize all these different ways we identify, and how those identifications are useful for the ego or the personality, because our ego and our personality is a tool. It's a way in which we go out and navigate the material plane. But our true nature is the presence itself. And how do we know this? From point A to point B, from birth to death, what's consistent? Presence itself. Your thoughts, your feelings, your body, all these things change, meaning they're transient in nature, and they're very much part of the GOD, the generate, organize, destroy pattern, which dominates the material plane. But the presence itself does not change. Your recognition of the presence may change. Your identification with the presence may change, but the presence is always the same. The consciousness is always the same, and you can't observe it because that's who you are. So if you're observing it, it's not your true nature. If you're observing a kink that you identify as part of your lifestyle and who you are, it's not who you are. It's part of your past. It's part of perhaps your future desires, but it's part of your ego, the mind structure, the matrix, if you will. So with all that said, hopefully you've learned a few things in this video, and once again, thank you for watching. Appreciate you.